rescue. Well, now you've seen my project car, and if you've watched my last video, I'll give you a little bit of an idea of what my plans are with it. In this video, I want to talk about buying a car like this, or any classic car. How do you do it? I get a lot of questions about buying classic cars and what to look for. There's 3 rules that I like to go by. Don't buy it over the phone. Call about it. Get all the history. Find out everything you can about the car. 2, get it inspected. Whether you inspect it yourself or whether you pay to have the vehicle inspected. And 3, don't ever pay the asking price. Now there's one more rule that kind of oversees and supersedes those 3 rules, and that is ignore all those rules if you know exactly what you're getting into, exactly what you want, and how rare is it. So let's say they only made 500 of these and you found one and you've been looking forever. It's okay to buy it over the phone. It's okay to trust that you're getting the car that you want. It doesn't matter what you're paying for it. You just want it that bad. When it comes to inspecting a vehicle, whether you do it yourself or whether you pay to have it done, you really need to scrutinize every nut and bolt. I worked for a few years for an appraisal company, and I thought I knew a lot about valuing a car and what to look for. Wow. As an appraiser, I had a simple appraisal form that was 2 pages, and that appraisal typically ran about $75. Just a once-over, quick look at everything, not really digging in to every single aspect of the vehicle. I had a 5-page report that I would do if I was going to do a full, highly detailed evaluation of a car, and then I would send that evaluation to an appraiser that would look at what that car sold for all over the country. They would look at all kinds of history reports. When it came to selling through eBay or through dealerships or through private parties, they would dig in and really find out what that vehicle would sell for within that 1 through 4 category. My form was made up for 1 through 5, 5 being absolutely perfect, brand new, new old stock, everything exactly the way you'd expect it, fresh out of the molds or fresh from a dealership. You rarely ever would see that. Even a new old stock part would have scratches from being on a shelf, or a little bit of rust or something from just sitting for so many years. A brand new replacement part, it might be perfect or too perfect. So when I was looking at every single piece and I would rate it from a 1 to a 5. You just rarely ever saw a 5, because if it's 70 years old, it's not likely you're going to find an absolute perfect part. So the way the sheet worked, you look at the quarter section of the car and you would scrutinize every piece. You're looking at the paint, you're looking at the fitment, you're looking at the finish. I'm looking this over and it's got chips in the paint. It's a horrible paint job. I see sand scratches. I see waves. There's holes in it. The alignment isn't very good. But it's a good fender. It's not all rusted out. It's not bent or mangled to the point where it's garbage. If it was garbage, it's a 0. If it's restorable, it's a 1. This fender, I would say it's probably in number 2 condition. So if you think about that, doing every little piece, okay, now I'm going to look at the grill. every one of these grill bars, the chrome's coming off. So, can they be re-chromed? Yes. They're not destroyed. They're not all rusted out. They're not junk. So, I would call these grill pieces a 1. The grill itself looks good. It's straight. All the bars look good. Call it maybe a 3. If it had perfect paint on it, maybe a 4. But it doesn't. These rings, pitted, junk, garbage, 0. So as you're going through that, okay, the headlight. It's a good looking headlight. It's got some pretty deep scratches in it though. This one's good. Does it work? Yep, they work. So, maybe a 4. It's a nice headlight. Deep scratches in it, maybe a 1. So after I've picked apart every single piece, there might be 12 pieces here. Then you do an average of a 4 and a 2 and a 1. Come up with an average of, say, a 2. A 2. This hood is straight, smooth. It's got a lot of ripples, got horrible paint on it. A 2. Now, if you keep going around the vehicle and you start averaging between a 1 and a 2, and you look at Hagerty, and Hagerty has valuations of the whole vehicle from a 1 to a 4, you can go over a 4. And on this vehicle, a 4 is $30,000, $40,000. There are 5s. So you can go above that $30,000, $40,000 like this car if it had the 6-cylinder motor and it was a concourse, absolute, perfect everything restored, maybe even a little over restored, then you can start pushing over the 4 to a 5 average. When I was doing appraisals, I only saw one vehicle ever that I just kept going 5, 5, 5. Wow, this is absolutely amazing. Oh, here's a 4. Here's another 4, 5, 5, 5. It's my truck. 14,000 original miles. I've been doing appraisals for 3-4 years, but when I turned in the appraisal of my truck, they didn't believe me. They said there's no way. That truck cannot be that old. It's a 1971 Ford pickup and be that perfect. The rubber seals around the doors, those go bad. They rot, they go hard, they crack. They didn't believe me that those seals were perfect. The truck had been stored in a controlled environment. It was attached to the house. The temperatures were always perfect. The humidity, everything was perfect. That truck was perfect. Everywhere you looked. There was a few things about it that had been changed, so it wasn't 100% original. So that brought it down just a little bit. He didn't believe me that that truck could be that perfect. I wanted so bad for him to come out and see it. He was in Pennsylvania. I was in Salt Lake City. He wouldn't come out to see it. And I said, you have got to see this truck. You have to use this as a guide of those number 5 vehicles. So let's get back to looking at this vehicle as an inspection. Now as I walk around this vehicle, it's hard to see, but you can see the ripples. The paint is pretty poor, a lot of dents. Front bumper, it could be re-chromed. This fender has some damage, but it's not really bad. It's repairable. You can see damage. These gaps are really nice, and the seams are nice. You can see inside this seam, it's got a lot of built-up paint, so it's obvious that it has been repainted. But I've seen them where they're just so bad, and it's got 7, 10 coats of paint where they just start to disappear, but then they chip like this, and they just look horrible. This door gap is nice. Being stored in a warehouse, this rubber didn't go all hard, but it's got paint on it. It's got a split in it. That'll still have to be replaced. Glass, you can see bubbles starting to go. I like to look to see if it's original glass, if it has markings of any kind from the factory. This glass doesn't have any markings. All the chrome and trim is really good. There's no real dings. These are pretty heavily pitted and you can't get them. So that's something that would have to be redone or go custom. You can see missing piece. These logos were put on with screws. So there's holes drilled all over, as well as all along here. Those holes will have to be welded over. You can fill over them. I've seen people fill over them. I don't like it. So I would tack weld over those holes. Pretty big scratch gouge along here. It's fairly deep. Again, chrome handles are bad. Chrome trim looks really good, but it's starting to rust along the edges, so that'll need to be re-chromed. Has a dent in it. The rubber seals along the convertible top are hard as stone. Top is garbage. One of the things that you really look for when you're dealing with convertible tops is all of this framework solid. All the pivot points, are they solid? There's tack strips. This one happened to be like an oak piece of wood that goes around the back. That's the tack strip. It also has oak all running across the front. So you'll want to take the top down, check all of those pivot points, put the top back up. There's a little bit of a bend right here where it's sagging. That'll have to be lifted up a little bit, but that's pretty simple. You can see where this has been repainted. They painted over all the strike plates. This was poorly done. Seal plates across the bottom are bad. Luckily, those are replaceable. Same thing with all along this edge. Painted pieces. The rubber seal is gone. It's all decayed and fallen apart. Door shuts nice. When it comes to rust and doors and how much work has been done on them, they're crimped over and flattened. Sometimes welded, sometimes they're just crimped and smashed on and sealed. You want to look at those edges, make sure they're not all rusty or they haven't been filled to the point where that inner lip is missing. You can't even see it anymore, as well as looking along the edges. These edges look really nice. Doesn't appear as though there's ever been any rust along any of these seams. These pieces could be refinished, but this one, it's like a pot metal or cast aluminum. It's got cracks in it. This back bumper, this piece here doesn't belong. This doesn't belong. That's actually off of a wagon. This rear bumper is in really good shape. It could be re-chromed, but I looked at the back side of this and somebody torched it off. So this bumper as a set for a wagon would be great, but it won't be able to be reused for a Jeepster. Not sure what these brackets were from. It's got holes drilled as well as drilled in these. This door, perfect gaps. This rear view mirror, pitted, but it's actually off of a DeSoto. I think I found that as a 5960 DeSoto. A lot of extra holes that people have drilled in it, probably for other rear view mirrors. Maybe this had a visor on it. Really big gap right here. This car, being from Washington State, he told me there's no rust. That is just solid. There's some bubbling along here that I was worried about, but it just runs in the paint. It's a terrible paint job, and as you can hear, there is no filler on there at all. That seam, solid. And just bring up a point now that I'm doing this. If you use a magnet, make sure it has a good plastic coating or a fabric coating, and don't drag it across the paint, especially if you've got a really nice vehicle. But this isn't. You can see the paint is pretty bad. Painted right over, big chips. No filler in that at all. You can see right down to bare metal. So pretty thin coat of paint on it. All underneath this seam. It's really smooth. The pinch weld along the bottom, that pinch weld, I can feel all the spot weld positions. So this hasn't been separated, cut open, and welded back together and filled. I thought this was a big rust hole until I got looking close. It's got a little Jeep emblem, which is pretty cool. That's riveted on, so I'll have to really concentrate to get that off without damaging it. So I do want to save that. See, there's a pretty good dent there. But again, nice body seams. I'm just not finding any filler in this vehicle. Again, really nice body seams. This piece should be soft. It's hard to stone. Same with these, even though they've been painted over. The rubber is soft underneath it, the paint. I don't know how easy it would be to get the paint off of that, if it makes sense. You can buy that rubber seal. License plate bracket is broken, cracked, but it is repairable. This filler panel on the back, there's a lot of aftermarket pieces that are fiberglass and plastic. So it's really nice to have this be the original metal one. All these snaps are for the side window curtains. Original wheels, all 5 of them are original. I had mentioned in another video that these were original 1970s tires, and they're in really good shape. There is no DOT markings on these at all. They started putting a DOT mark on similar to this one, and they would have different codes, and there's one that would be, let's say it was 29-0 number. That's the 29th week of 1980. Anything earlier than 1980, they didn't put those on. So there's no indication at all on what year this was built. If it was built and manufactured after 1980, there would be that code. And then in 2000, they started using 4 digits. So the 4-digit code then would be pretty obvious, but there's no codes on these. The rubber's nice. There's no cracking or weather checking on the sidewalls. So it's just another indication that this has been stored inside a warehouse. Now, typically when I'm looking at an engine bay, I'm typically looking at it as though it has the original engine and drivetrain in it. But if it's a hot rod, you'd be looking at maybe a hot rod, a little V8 or something in here. But this, oh man, crazy. Pinto 4-cylinder. So I'm not really going to scrutinize anything about this little motor, other than it runs smooth, it runs good. When you first start it up, it blows out a big old cloud of blue smoke, and then it just mellows right out. So valve guides, probably letting some oil down into the valves, and then when you fire it up, it burns that oil. But once it burns off, it does run clean. That motor mount right there, really crazy how this is all stacked in. The welds are booger welds. They're not the best welds, but it all looks like it holds together pretty good, except when it comes to the frame. I don't know how it's really attached to the frame. It doesn't look like it is. There might be some really thin, light welds on the backside. I don't know. The only thing I can figure is this heavy little Pinto motor is just sitting on the frame on all this welded together pieces. The other side's even worse. I can't really get in there to see it, to show it on camera, but that's when I saw that, and no, this car is not drivable the way it is. In a panic situation, having to give it gas, having to slam on the brakes, I can just see this thing shifting and moving. Wires, hodgepodge, bird's nest, plastic loom shoved through the firewall, underneath the dash, even worse. Just crazy, insane mix of new wires and new connectors, port connectors. You can see that one looks like it's a little bit melted and burnt right here. Not a good sign. You got to watch for those. Just really scrutinize when you're looking at wiring. What do the connections look like? Where does it go? Is there a good grommet around the firewall so that those wires aren't shifting and moving onto a metal edge that cuts through? Radiator core support. See where it was hacked off, bent over. So that piece is pretty messed up. I'm going to have to put some labor into straightening all that out. It does have an aftermarket pull fan. And then down there's a cooler that is actually hooked up to the transmission since they didn't have a radiator that had the cooler lines in it for a transmission. Yuga horn doesn't work. Well, it makes a little bit of a grinding noise. There's a lot of plumbing in here that it doesn't make any sense. That's probably where what might have been an air cannon. There's some air lines. There's a lot of cables that have been cut off. Since this car was coming from a desert climate where it doesn't freeze, and then it's going to an area where it can freeze, you'll definitely want to check the antifreeze and make sure that it will protect you in the cold. It doesn't have very good protection. This is bad, needs to be drained. You want to check your oil. Wow, the oil is up and it's clean, really clean. Who knows how old the oil is, but it's actually clean. A lot of things that are plugged off. Got some vacuum lines that have a hose with a screw in it. There's other lines that have nothing, they're just open. You'll want to check your belts. This has got good soft belt. This hose is like petrified hard. That's another thing you'd want to really keep an eye on. Could crack and break. A lot of times these do split when they're bent, when put into an application they weren't intended. This has a pretty good kink in it right here, which was restricting the flow. That is a problem. The transmission lines that go to the cooler, those are leaking. Speaking of leaks, the rear end in this leaked, and it leaked a lot. So that's another thing you got to think about. If it's still leaking, or if it finally stops, it's a pretty good indication that it's leaked out all of its fluids. So that's another thing you got to really look for. Got a brand new battery. Well, transmission fluid is very clean too. And when it comes to drivability, you want to check all of your gauges, make sure they work. Windshield wipers. I don't see any gauge lights that work. Don't know what these are. None of them were hooked up to anything. I don't know what they were ever hooked up with in the first place. I don't know if this used to have a heater in it, but none of these are attached. Cigarette lighter, key. It has a light here that says brake. I don't know if that's actually connected. Lots of buttons that don't work. Probably had something to do with the clown car. Like switches don't work. Aftermarket gauges. Amp gauge. Curious to know whether these gauges work. This is one of those things there that if I was buying this car to drive it, I would want to know what works and what doesn't, what I can rely on. Since I'm blowing this car all apart, it doesn't really matter, but just to show you some of the things to look for if you are going to do your own inspection. Glove box opens, no liner in it. It does have a key, but it's not a matching key. Got blinker for both sides. This is an aftermarket turn signal system. This car shows 46,000 original miles. A lot of times you can get an idea with the wear on the pedals, wear on upholstery. You can see signs here and there whether or not that's 146,000 miles, 246,000 miles, or if it's original at only 46,000 miles. You don't see these with a lot of miles on them. The 6-cylinder cars, I've seen some of them go 100,000 miles. That's when you start to see all the drivetrain go, and it starts to get pretty worn, especially the front end. So I'll show you how to look at the front end. This has kingpins, and if this was 146,000 miles, those kingpins could be really worn out, and you can't get them. All the catalogs that I've been searching through, those are discontinued, no longer available. So if they are bad, you've got to look for used ones somewhere. And if you were going to buy this to drive it again, you would want to make sure those were in good shape so that you could depend on this thing steering and stopping the way it's intended to. Oh, another knob, the choke knob. That's not hooked up either. Ashtray's missing. Rearview mirror is attached, but not usable. Steering wheel is actually in pretty good shape. It's got a couple cracks in it. It'd be pretty easy to restore. So this is one of those areas you have to be very critical of. Again, no grommet. You got wires going through a firewall with a sharp edge. Cause a fire. The throttle pedal, kind of a half-assed bracket that's been welded together and bolted into place. I don't think this is original Willys stuff, highly unlikely. It's mounted too far over to the left. Again, I mentioned before in another video, that pedal is actually originally a clutch pedal. It has been converted to the brake, and the brake pedal should be in between these two, has been cut off. Really hokey, not a good situation when it comes to braking. That the pedal is too far away. It's super soft. You have to pump it up to stop. In an emergency situation, the brakes wouldn't be there for you. Wiring, it's got an aftermarket with a mix of original fabric wires. It's not the best situation either. It's got a few fuses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fuses. And then a whole bunch of stacked wires there beyond. You can see in that black bridge. These are the kind of things you really need to be cautious of. It was not wired properly. Seats are in pretty good shape. Back one's missing. Cheap, wrinkled up carpet. I think this is an original door panel. It has a vinyl pressed in look. It looks like it's probably the original boards. You'll want to check your spare tire. Another old fiberglass puncture sealant. Nice. And it is a gold wall combo. Wow, that's a pretty cool little tire. And again, it's not weather checked or cracking. G7815, pretty cool. No date stamp of any kind. It still has the little nubs. This is like a brand new tire. So when it comes to these tires, this tire is a spare as well as the tires on the car. I was telling you about the code that would be on here for its age. You want to be careful of that, because if you've got a tire that's more than 10 years old, you don't want to be driving on the highway with that tire. There's too many risks of it coming apart. You want to stay in the 7-year and less range when it comes to the age of a tire, just to play it safe. You want to check the wheel this way. That will be your tie rod ends and your steering. The tie rod ends actually feel really good. You want check the rod itself. These are very tight. The kingpins are here in the back. Those will rock if they're worn. I'm not getting any movement at all. Very tight. I hear a little bit of knocking and movement on this outer bearing, so it could be adjusted. And it's interesting, it has this big stud, and from what I was reading, the way this whole mechanism works with the bearings and the brakes, there's special tools you have to use to take this apart in order to do the brakes. So I'd like to look at the brakes too, but I don't have those tools. If you're buying this and you're planning on driving it, you want to make sure those brakes are good. So you would want to, at this point, take the wheel off, pull the brake drum, and inspect those brakes, inspect the drum. I'm very impressed with the kingpins. You'll want to check all of your suspension points, your shocks. Typically with the shocks, you would just bounce the car and see if it brings it to a stop. That's the best way to test your shock. A lot of grease and grime in here. So it appears as though whoever it was that owned this when it got most of its miles, they greased everything really well. So everything has good lubrication, no real sign of wear. So I would say that this probably is 45, 46,000 original miles, just judging from the wear and tear on the suspension. Now looking underneath the car, you can see the transmission in there does look new. I mean, it's shiny silver, but this area right here, this was the point that I was pretty worried about until I really got looking at it. It's not roadworthy by no means. That transmission cross member is just sitting on a bracket that was welded to the frame, and then they cut a hole in this frame X-brace. If I was going to restore this to an original show car, factory original look, that would have to be fixed. It'd be tough to mimic that whole style with that flare on the edge, but it could be done. This is one of those things that might have made more sense to cut this out of another frame or just replace the frame altogether. So it's not the best to work with, but if I can make this into a hot rod, no big deal. I'll probably cut that, make it nice and smooth, nice and clean, and actually put the exhaust through there with the dual exhaust. It does have the emergency brake system. I'm surprised because it doesn't work. So it's probably just a matter of the cable isn't hooked up right or something isn't put together correctly. But this is the part that I was really excited about. I mean, if you're going to buy a car that you're going to work on and restore, you don't want any rust in these areas. These cross members are solid. We got some surface rust, but no real rot. All of the floor, no rot. It's got some holes that have been cut in it for more air lines that are weird. So yeah, it's definitely what he told me when he said it was all rust-free underneath. This is one of the big air tanks that are underneath it. I'm assuming it's an air tank. I couldn't find anything else that it possibly could have been. The rear end, you can see it's covered with years and years of leaking. Good rear end, good and solid, but the gear ratio in it is just all wrong for what I want to do. If you look at that shock absorber, you can see there's a big washer on there and then a dainty little cotter pin. You wouldn't go very far before that shock absorber fell off. The springs look really good. The exhaust on the Pinto motor is pretty decent exhaust. Got a glass pack cherry bomb in the middle of it. I haven't seen those in many, many years. So that was definitely put on back in the 70s. But again, solid floor, no rust. A lot of surface rust on the frame, but nothing major. Well, again, here behind the rear wheel, solid. No rust. This is another typical rust area. Interesting that it has a trailer hitch and receptacle for wiring. So they probably pulled a trailer behind this in the parades. Maybe it even pulled a float. You can see it's got dual springs. They put in an overload spring, probably for all the fat dignitaries and crazy clowns. This gas tank is in excellent shape. Another thing you want to look at when you are buying a vehicle like this old, you'll want to inspect all of those brake lines. Make sure they're solid, they're not squished. You want to make sure they're not heavily rusted. You'll always want to check your fluid, check all of your lines. They'll usually have a soft line connection going to each wheel cylinder. You'll want to check all of those. If you're not up to doing all that yourself, I would recommend just taking it to a shop and having them inspect it for you. You'll definitely want to lift up the carpet and look all underneath it. Look for any surface rust, any original paint, coatings. There is zero surface rust on this floor. Just absolutely awesome. So definitely something you want to look at. You want to look at the front and rear, around the rear seat area. This seat bracket is broken off underneath here. It is mounted fairly good on the center hump and on this corner, but definitely would want to get that welded. Oh, also I was just noticing underneath this carpet is the original factory fabric coated wires. So that's pretty unusual. You don't see a lot of. These get all corroded and decayed, and they end up actually, all the fabric falls off and you've got exposed wires and you've got potential fire. That's another thing. You want to inspect all of the fabric wires in these older cars. You don't want to take any risk of causing a fire. So another area you're going to want to look at is the floor, the trunk area. This has a trunk area. It's all covered. They built a platform back there for the clowns to stand on or sit on, dignitaries, whatever they did back there. So I don't have access to it until I just really tear it all out. So in a normal sedan, you can open up the trunk and really inspect all inside the trunk. You get cars from the Rust Belt, the Midwest, New England area, you're typically going to see a lot of rust in the trunk. You want to look at all of your shock mounts, your mounts for your rear end, really inspect all those areas. Same thing with the frames. This frame is all solid I-beam type frames. It's really an awesome frame system. Some of the seat frames, you'll want to inspect along the mounting points, especially around the engine and transmission. Those C's with flex, they have a tendency to crack. So you really want to check all of your frames to make sure there's no cracks in it. If it's boxed in, look at all the boxes, the way it's welded together, and any seams along those. I've seen some of the Buicks, like my Skylark, where that's been boxed in and where it's seamed together, they've trapped dirt and water and moisture and they completely rust out there. And the frames will just collapse. So you'll want to knock on the frame, you'll want to really test it, you want to poke it with a good solid object to make sure it's all solid, and really take time to look at the frames. If you've got rusted floors and you got a rusted trunk, inspect that frame, really look at it. I don't want to start this up in my garage, but normally I would take it for a test drive and I would put it in gear, put it in drive, put it in reverse, put it in drive, listen for any clunking noises. That could be an indicator of sloppiness in your end or your transmission, or maybe in the U-joints of the drive line. So you want to check those. And while it's in the air, I can easily get underneath and twist that. Twist it, listen for any movement, any sloppiness in any of those joints. Once you've taken the car for a drive, check your brakes, check your steering, really get a feel for the car, get it good warm, and then once you get back, open up the hood, check your hoses, check for any leaks. See if they've softened up. Like this one is really, really hard. See, make sure it softens up. Make sure it's warm so you know that everything's circulating. If it's not circulating, you might have a thermostat that is locked up, so it's not circulating enough fluid to get heat to the radiator. That's a good time indicator that maybe the engine is getting super, super hot and your radiator is still cold. Fill your radiator if you can get to it. This one's kind of hard to get to. Check the radiator to see if there's any seepage areas. You can typically tell if it's been seeping or leaking, that you might have some residues on it, so you want to watch for that. Check your heater. Turn the heater on and off. Make sure that it works. This one doesn't have one. Make sure that that heater core is getting fluid through it. If they've bypassed it, it's a good chance they bypassed it because the heater core was leaking. Some of those heater cores are getting pretty expensive and they're pretty difficult to get to. I had to replace the heater core in my Pontiac, and you've got to take the front fender off to do that. So let's say you've gone through all of this and now you're wanting to buy it. It's what you want. Or you start doing all this and you go, I'm not sure what I'm getting into here. And you work with the current owner and say, you know what, I need to have this inspected. I need to get it to a shop or have somebody come in and look at it that knows that type of a car and what it is they're looking for. But if you feel comfortable about doing it yourself, and now it comes time to negotiating, you got to ask about the history. If the car has a beautiful, brand new, shiny paint job, you got to ask, how long ago was this painted? Last week? Oh, so what kind of shape was this in when you bought it? How long have you had it? That's a key. If they've only had it for a couple months, chances are it was a quick flip and they may have just put a quick and easy paint job on. Bondo over rust holes, sand it smooth, put on a shiny finish, and call it good. You've got to really start looking and scrutinizing a car that has that potential. They didn't own it for very long. Ask a lot of questions. This guy, it was obvious. He hadn't owned it for only a couple of months when I found it. But at least I knew. I knew what I was getting into. I was asking all the right questions. Title. That was my biggest fear with this car. It was obvious once he gave me the title. The title was still registered and licensed to the previous owner before him in Washington State. I've been down that road. It is very difficult sometimes to get titles transferred with a bill of sale and the middleman and working around all that paperwork. I said, I'm not going to buy this car until I know I can get this title in my name. Typical bill of sale, all the paperwork, everything signed. Take the title and all the paperwork to the DMV. The DMV finalizes everything. You pay your fees and you leave. You get your title in the mail. It was all legit because 2 weeks later I got the title in the mail and it was mine. So really be careful when it comes to titles and out of state and bill of sales and all your paperwork. Make sure it's right. If you're dealing from the owner and that paperwork is in his name, you can feel very comfortable that he owns it. Speaking of which, you've got to make sure when you get that title, is it clear? Is there a bank holder on that? Is there a lien? You got to make sure those liens are signed off. Okay, you got the title, you got your paperwork, you got everything, you're ready to buy. You got to ask the question, what's your bottom dollar? Don't just go like I did. I didn't dicker with the guy. I already knew. We'd had the conversation. He's not going to budge. He wanted $8,000 for this car. He had other buyers that are waiting for me to step aside. There was no negotiating. But you got to ask. What's your bottom dollar? What's the lowest you're willing to go on this? If they ho-hum around saying, oh, make me an offer, throw them a lowball offer. You might get pissed, but you gotta get a starting point. All right. Sorry I took so long trying to tell this story, but there is so much to be covered when it comes to buying something like this, and you want to make sure that you're covered. If you don't feel comfortable with it, get an inspection done. You don't have to pay a ton of money for an inspection. you can get a local garage. A lot of places will do it for a small fee. Get it up on the hoist, look it all over, just so you know what you're getting into. So hopefully this helps. Now you can drive it and you can enjoy it, or maybe it's not quite ready to drive. Maybe there's just a few things that you're going to bring it into the garage and you're going to tinker with it and you're going to do it yourself. So that's my next video. I want to talk about what it is that you can do yourself and what your levels are. Are you going to just put in some carpet, maybe some upholstery, or top done? Going to hire some of it out, you're going to do a little bit of yourself. You're going to do the body work, brakes, brake lines, master cylinders, clutches. Can you do all those kinds of things? You're going to have some good skills, welding, alignment. You need to know what you're getting into if you're going to blow a car completely apart. Do you have the skills to take it back, or is it going to end up being a parts car when you're done? I've seen that happen. You end up in storage. They're in boxes. People try to buy it. They don't know what they're getting into. You end up giving it away. You end up selling it just either real cheap or just selling it for parts. All right. Well, thank you for watching my video. I hope this helps. Happy hunting. I hope you can find what you want. I hope you can find something that's within your skill set. Thanks again for watching. Goodbye for now.